question I have for you would be which aspects of Whitehead's philosophy do you think are most helpful for, or hold the most promise for, moving science beyond materialism?
Well, there's one aspect is the kind of memory aspect, what I call morphic resonance. But I mean, I'm obviously biased here. I find the idea of morphic resonance much easier to convey to people and to use than prehension or some of the way, or concrescence, or these Whiteheadian terms that refer to something similar. And the thing is, it's not clear whether what they're referring to is that similar or not. You know, and this is where, when I brought this question up at Claremont College, the seminar room sort of dissolved into different interpretations and different factions, and even among the Whitehead scholars there was no unanimity as to exactly what he meant and stuff. So I don't see that as the most helpful aspect, because I can just talk about morphic resonance without, I didn't refer to Whitehead in coming up with the idea. You know, in a sense, the connection with Whitehead came after the idea. But the bit that I personally wrestle with and think about and find most stimulating and talk about in my lectures, where it really grips people, is the idea that the relation of mind and body, or mental, the mental and physical pole, is a process in time, that the mental pole's the future pole and the physical pole's the past pole. Now, as a way of interpreting mind-body relationships, I think that's extraordinarily stimulating, interesting, exciting, undeveloped, and full of possibilities. And I'm never sure whether my own interpretations of it are going way beyond what Whitehead intended, or whether it would fit. But the idea, you see, that, I mean, I read things like Journal of Consciousness Studies, I go to conferences on consciousness, and because I talk about it in various contexts, like the sense of being stared at, and morphic resonance, and memory, and so on. And I haven't seen any coherent approaches. You know, the quantum theory ones seem to me not illuminating at all. They're obfuscating and stuff. But by far the most illuminating to me is the idea that mental causation works from virtual futures towards the past, whereas physical causation works from the past towards the future. And these two streams of causation sort of overlap in the present. And because the mental causation is about possibilities and choosing among them. I also find it very helpful because when people say, what do you mean by consciousness? As opposed to, I first make the distinction that the mind can be conscious or unconscious. The unconscious mind is still mental, but not conscious. And most of our habits are unconscious, but they're still mental. So if we come to consciousness per se, then starting from Whitehead, my answer is that it's about choosing among possible actions. And the role of consciousness is to choose among possibilities. And therefore, consciousness is an arena of possibilities. And possibilities are always things that haven't happened yet. So as soon as you've chosen among possible actions, the causal chain works, as it were, from that choice, which is about a future state back through time, from a virtual future back through time. And you see, in the world I live in, there are a lot of people discussing things like precognition, precognitive dreams. Of course, Libet's experiments that show that the conscious choice happens after the mental change, after the physical change.
The brain change, yeah.
The brain change. So the brain change happens first, and that happens afterwards. The thing is that there's a lot here where this could be relevant to phenomena that certainly occur. I mean, I do research on precognition and presentiment myself. And presentiment, feeling the future, I think is an established fact. Of course, it's not part of established in the main academic world because they say it's impossible, it's parapsychological, it's impossible, and so on. But actually, it would requires the idea that consciousness is somehow working from the future. And there, of course, it's not a virtual future, it's an actual future. But this is a whole area where my ideas are not fully clear on this, but my starting point for thinking about these knotty problems is Whitehead, and I don't know any other starting point other than Whitehead for these questions that makes sense to me.
Yeah, I like that this polarity between mind and matter, or past causality out of the past versus causality into the future. This does seem to me to be a very fruitful avenue for opening up science to a different understanding of the way that nature operates, because there's so much what I would call residual Cartesianism or Cartesian dualism in even materialist science, because the mind doing the observing and all the theorizing and stuff is sort of bracketed out and forgotten about, whereas nature is just thought of as a machine where only efficient or mechanical causality is operative, which would be the push from the past. There's no pull, or as Whitehead would call it, lures from the future in the materialist picture. And clearly, to understand, it's almost inescapable and stares you in the face in the biological realm that there's some need to invoke a lure or a future pull or a purpose, a telos of some kind. But even in physics, when we understand the evolution of the universe through supposedly billions of years of different stages of development, there seems to be a tendency towards organization into stars and galaxies. And these are sources of profound order that we wouldn't expect to emerge if there wasn't some sort of a lure or tendency, if there weren't some future possibilities that seem to want to manifest. And I think Whitehead provides a very rigorous, coherent, and scientifically applicable way of understanding this interplay between mental and physical causation. So I completely agree that might be the most fruitful avenue to draw on Whitehead to sort of fertilize the scientific worldview. And then, yeah, what you're saying about precognition, I've had this discussion with many people, very interested in your work and who have had experiences themselves of something like a vision of the future, or they have a dream and then something happens that confirms what the dream was suggesting. And it seems that, and David Ray Griffin has written about this, I think specifically in reference to your ideas. And it seems that in Whitehead, there's some room for offering an explanation of this, but certainly for Whitehead, he would reject the idea that the future is already determined. And so for him, maybe there are certain possibilities that are more probable than others, but that even if, I think Whitehead would say, if someone has a vision of the future, something that's going to happen next year or even a few days from now, Whitehead would say that's not yet determined. It could be otherwise. And maybe in that moment when that precognitive experience happens, that particular future that was envisioned is the most likely, but it could still change. And so I wonder what you think about that wiggle room that Whitehead would insist upon. That
well, I insist on it too, because I think that I totally reject the idea the future is determined and this sort of Einstein block universe view. And one of the things that comes out of psychical research is that when you have a presentiment or a precognition, then the precognition is not necessarily of something, well, it's not something in the objective outer world. It's a future state of your own experience. So some people in this area say we should call it precall as opposed to recall, that recall is recalling something that happened to you in your experience in the past, and precall is linking to your experience in the future. So it's your experience you're linking to, not the outer world. And J.W. Dunn was, who wrote that famous book, An Experiment with Time, in the 1920s. Still, I think, the best book on precognitive dreaming. J.W. Dunn pointed out that he had this dream of a volcanic eruption in Martinique, leading to 20,000 deaths. And he wrote it down because he recorded his dreams. And then he read in the Daily Telegraph a couple of days later, there'd been this eruption in Martinique with 20,000 deaths. And for him, this was a pre-call of this, reading this a few days later. However, the twist on this is very interesting, that what he'd done, he'd misread it. It wasn't 20,000, it was 2,000. And when he later checked up, he found that actually when he looked at the paper, it didn't say 20,000. He thought it had said 20,000. So it wasn't what the paper actually said or what had actually happened. It was what he thought it had said or what that mattered. So, so that's one thing, you see. And then there's presentiment. This is a short-term thing that Dean Radin's worked on. I don't know if you've read about presentiment.
Yeah, I'm familiar with some of Radin's work, yeah.
It's over a few seconds, you respond to something that's emotionally arousing. So, you see, one way of dealing with that would be, again, taking a lead from Whitehead, that we normally think of the present as defined in terms of, instantaneous microsecond or something. But actually, I mean, his word, the specious present, is about a spreading out of the present, I suppose. But
which he gets from William James, yeah.
Yes, that you could actually say that the present in relation to dreams, our present may be extended over several days, or our present may be extended over, several 10 seconds or something. And it's obvious that present is, with the fact that the cinema works shows that we actually, a tenth of a second, we blur them all together. Our consciousness is spread out in time, but in some circumstances it may be spread out more, in others less. And if it's spread out in time, the usual assumption is that the present instant is here, and if it's spread out, it's 10 seconds into the past. But if it's spread out in time, it could be 5 seconds into the future and 5 seconds into the past. Right. And in which case, something that happens 5 seconds in the future is part of the present and would cause reactions, emotional responses to erotic pictures in Dean Radin's experiments. I'm actually, parapsychology is very hard to get people to accept, but I'm working at the moment with somebody developing a day trading market app. And I've discovered by interviewing people on trading floors in the City of London, people are doing this day trading. They're predicting the market within the next 3 or 4 seconds. They're sort of saying it's going to go up and down. This can't be based on any rational analysis of trends or reading the Wall Street Journal or anything. And when I've talked to people on the trading floors, I've asked to speak to the best trader. I'm friendly with the chap who runs one of the best companies in London. He's a kind of fan of mine. So he let me into the trading floor and I was able to speak to these people. And I asked to speak to his best trader, and he said, this guy's phenomenal. He just seems to know when news is going to flash up on the screen, just seems to feel which of the 10 screens he's working at, where the action's going to be. Just seems to know where it's going to go. And I talked to this chap, and I said, do you know how you know? He said, no. He said, I read the papers, and I just think, I'm sort of tuned in and stuff. But when I said, has it occurred to you it might be presentiment? He said, what's that?
Yeah,
I think this is actually happening all the time. So I'm trying to develop an app people could use on their mobile phones, where you can. We'd start with monopoly money, sort of. You'd give people $500,000 to start with, and they trade, and doing it just on feelings. And if one could show that you could make millions by developing this intuitive skill. The question of does presentiment exist or not would cease to be a question. People would be clamoring to go on training courses, and no computer would be able to compete.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm friends with Tom Stedall, who I believe worked
Yes,
with you
yes,
on
yes. He's worked
an
on
app
that.
about phone calls.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it's really wonderful to accumulate data on this. And my understanding, as a sort of general takeaway from a lot of this parapsychological research, is that there is a significantly higher than random correlation between even the average person, their ability to predict the future is more than random.
Mm.
And then there are some people who seem to have a special capacity for this, and it's
Yeah.
significantly higher than random. But the data is there, waiting to be integrated into our understanding of what's possible. But so many scientists locked in the materialist paradigm just refuse to look at the data, and
Yes,
this has been a problem for you for many decades, I think.
yes, they just refuse to look at it. It doesn't matter how good it is, they just refuse to look at it. You know, I had an argument with Daniel Dennett 2 or 3 years ago. We were at a conference, and I said, what about a public debate? I said, you're a member of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. You're implacably opposed to psychic phenomena. I said, what about doing a public debate? And then we could find out why it is you're so opposed. And he said, no, I don't want to do that. I said, why not? He said, if I did a public debate, I have to read up the literature. And he said, I just don't want to waste time on something that's so obviously false. And I said, well, if you haven't read the literature, and how can you possibly be sure it's so far? He got terribly angry. He was just really angry that, when I pressed him. It's a denial movement. And whereas you see, some people try within I'm on the parapsychology discussion list, which is an email discussion written that Dean Radin's on it, and Julia Mossbridge. Most people in the field are on it, and most of the discussions about precognition are about possible retrocausation in quantum theory, which I don't think is a very fruitful line. I mean, it might be, but they've been on this for decades now, and it hasn't got anywhere. Mm-hmm. I mean, in the Epiphany Philosophers, we were discussing this in the 1960s. So there's a tremendous sense of déjà vu with a lot of these discussions. Whereas Whitehead, if we have the idea of conscious causation and mental causation working from virtual futures to the past, then sometimes from actual futures, this could be a starting point. It's the most promising one I can think of, as well as being the most promising starting point for thinking about what makes consciousness different from unconsciousness, and also, as we were saying, how to understand the mind-body relationship.
Yeah. I mean, the way I often look at it is that if we were to adopt the Whiteheadian paradigm, if we were to fully inhabit the Whiteheadian cosmos, then all of this parapsychological phenomena just becomes psychology. It's a feature of our experience, and we have to incorporate it into our normal understanding of how human consciousness, the place that it has in relationship to the rest of the universe. And so it's not paranormal anymore. It's just perfectly normal. Whitehead even says this in the fourth part, towards the end of Process and Reality. He's just finished this really elaborate reconstruction of how we understand space. He calls it the extensive continuum. It's the hardest part of the hardest book that Whitehead wrote. And at the end of it, he's like, one of the implications of this new understanding of space and energy vectors is that telepathy is likely a real phenomenon. He just drops that in one sentence, doesn't say much more about it. But his cosmology normalizes what for the materialist paradigm is woo-woo and spooky and strange, but it's not strange in Whitehead's universe.
No, well, I completely agree. I mean, for me, it has to be normal, not paranormal. In fact, I don't like the word parapsychology. I prefer psychic research. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, I think there's an area there where Whitehead's ideas could be relevant to science in yet another way, in a much more mainstream area, which is that in developmental biology, more and more people, or at least some people, use the concept of morphogenetic fields. Not in my sense, because that would be too provocative, but more in Waddington's sense of the word. And as you know, Waddington was very influenced by Whitehead. I don't know if you've tracked that.
Yep, yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But you know, in his famous diagram of the creode,
Mm-hmm.
with the canalized pathway of change, you're familiar with that, are you?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, basically, when René Thom, the French mathematician, worked out, you know, the founder of catastrophe theory, worked out models for creodes in morphogenetic fields, the end point of the creode he called the attractor, using the concept of the attractor, which is in dynamics, you know, a well-known concept in mathematical dynamics.
Yep.
And basically, this leads to the idea that development is goal-directed, and it's a way in which teleology has been smuggled back in to science. And the mathematicians who developed the dynamical attractor didn't know teleology was banned in science, and you know they just made models, and this was a good way of making a model. And in these models, interestingly, the ball rolling down the groove, or the basin of attraction, which is the principal metaphor in dynamics, is basically a pudding basin. You throw little marbles in and they all roll and end up at the bottom. The source of the attraction in all these models is gravitation.
Mm-hmm.
And personally, I think that gravitation is an attractive force. In other words, I think gravitation is a lure from the future. It's usually treated as simply, you know, something in Newton's equations or something. But if you think about it, what gravitation would do, left to its own devices, would pull the entire universe into an ultimate black hole, into a final unity. Now, it's opposed by the dark energy, the expansive force that's making the universe expand. But if you took away dark energy and left it to gravitation, the whole universe would begin collapsing inwards, and stars and galaxies would amalgamate, and everything would finally implode in the opposite of the Big Bang, the Big Crunch. And there'd be the ultimate attractor of gravity would be a final unity that mirrored the initial unity at the moment of the Big Bang. And so I think gravitation's much, much more mysterious than most people assume. You know, you just think, oh, we've got the equations of gravitation, you know, product of the masses, inverse square of the distance, gravitational constant. Whitehead was, of course, very interested in this because his mathematical theory of general relativity made somewhat different predictions from Einstein's, and allowed for variability in the gravitational constant, which actually happens.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that attractive forces, including gravitation, and teleological processes modeled by attractors in developmental biology, goal-directed development, are something which mechanistic science has nothing to say about, because teleology was amputated in the 17th century. Mm-hmm. And it's been smuggled back in by these mathematical models, but not fully explicitly. And so teleology is the elephant in the room of modern science, and you need to have it to explain why we have purposes and why organisms are purposive. And when I was studying biology at school, I was told the very last thing you were allowed to say was to say, what is a wing for or an eye for? Because that implies it's got a purpose. You could say, why is it that natural selection worked on random variants, which gave an increased ability to see that could finally result through long periods of random selection in an eye? That was what you had to say. You couldn't say, what's an eye for? And of course, the dishonesty in that is that living organisms already exist, and they already have their ultimate purposes of survival and reproduction. They're already purposive, and these structures serve their purposes. So they're within an already teleological system. So personally, I've always found Aristotle much more helpful than any other philosopher in this respect, you know, with final causes.
Yeah.
And in a sense, you get a hint of that in Whitehead, but for when I'm thinking about that, I go back to Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas more than Whitehead, because it's clearer to me. But I think that in the context of modern science, that people like Michael Levin at Tufts, I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but
I don't think so. What is he? What's his research about?
He's by far the best and most interesting developmental biologist
11.
operating at the moment, in my view. Levin.
Mm-hmm.
And he's wrote a paper on morphogenetic fields, and he's done fascinating work on morphogenesis. You see, almost everyone in developmental biology is still obsessed with the bottom-up explanation in terms of genes and molecular biology. And so he's very well, and I think he's aware of like Whitehead's work, and he might be somebody that you could bring into your survey.
Okay.
And Merlin's into Levin too, and he's very, very prolific. But let me give you an example of the kinds of experiments he's doing. In one experiment, he trained flatworms, which are very simple worms, with high regenerative capacity. He trained them to avoid particular things on a standard learning, moving around learning protocol, avoid colored light of a particular kind. So you can train them, they learn. It's conditioned reflex type thing. He then cut off their heads, where what little brain they have is located. And within a few days, they regenerate a head. And when they've regenerated the head, they remember everything they'd learned.
Fascinating.
Fascinating. So you see, so when I emailed him about that experiment, and I said, well, in his paper, he said, well, that suggests the memory must be stored, distributed throughout the whole body, not just in the central ganglion.
And perhaps the environment as well.
And perhaps the environment. But he's got a motive behind all this, which is to move biology on to a much more holistic approach. And for example, he's been studying the development of African clawed frog, Xenopus development. And he's shown that if you look at the embryos as they develop, he's got a electrically sensitive dye which reveals electrical potential differences. So with living samples under the microscope, you can actually see the electric field around the embryo. Now, of course, molecular biologists and genetic engineering people don't see electric fields because all they do is grind things up and analyze the genes. And they don't look for electric fields. They're invisible to them. And then what you see is in the area that's going to become a face, two areas sort of light up. And then another area, the eyes and the mouth sort of light up. You can actually see them under the microscope. And as he points out, they've done all the genetic analysis. This is not because the mouth and the eye genes have been activated and are giving signals that cause the change in electrical potential. This electrical change occurs before the genes are activated, and in fact seems to trigger the activation of the appropriate genes. In other words, there's literally a field, in this case an electrical field, patterning the developing system. Then, of course, the next question is, what patterns the electrical field? Now, he doesn't address that question because I think the answer would have to be a morphogenetic field, which I think work through electric fields.
Yeah.
But he's pushing up against the very limits of where you can go in contemporary biology. He's sticking to electricity. He doesn't mention me or morphogenetic fields. And what Levin is doing is this stuff gets on the cover of Science and on Nature and stuff, and everyone says, what fascinating research and stuff. And his papers are always full of molecular biology data where he proves about the genes and clones the genes and that sort of thing. So people say, wow, this is good science, because it's familiar to them. So he's the person who's, I would say today, at the very frontier of where things are going and leading the way.
That's so wonderful. Thank you for sharing his research. It's quite astonishing, and it makes me. I'm profoundly grateful to the scientists who do the slow, difficult, detailed laboratory work of establishing these things. And I understand why he wants to be so careful not to speculate about its larger implications. And maybe that's the role for philosophers to step in and look at his scientific work and say, well, this is what it might mean for the larger field of biology and the place of life in the universe. But it almost seems as though, from a Whiteheadian or a Bergsonian point of view, the part of the living organism that we can see and weigh, and that we call material, it's almost like it's the wake left behind a creative process that unfolds in a way that's invisible to our normal capacities to sense and measure. It's the morphic field, perhaps, but it's as if there's a creative unfolding occurring at a subtler level. And what science, materialistic science, has been studying is the material left in the wake of this creative process that's unfolding, and trying to it's as if we're trying to understand what makes the boat go by just studying the wake behind it, right? And these thinkers like Whitehead or Bergson allow us to understand that we need to go deeper to understand the causal influences at play here.
Yes, and what's steering the boat and why it goes in one direction rather than another. I agree, it's a very good metaphor. We're looking at the wake. Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that's a very good metaphor. Most real scientific discoveries come from intuitive, imaginative leaps. The entire incentive system within institutional science is not based on changing the world for the better or coming up with useful inventions. It's based on the number of papers you get published in high prestige journals. Basically, what I'm trying to do is to move the sciences on beyond the materialist dogmatism.
Let's apply the scientific method and see whether they hold up.
If they think it's impossible, then all the evidence must be flawed, and there's no point wasting time looking at it. If you count the number of independent scientists in the world, it's vanishingly small. Part of the revolution in science would be a bit like the gay liberation movement, people coming out of the closet, because there's already plenty of holistically minded scientists.
Welcome, Dr. Rupert Sheldrake. I have been fascinated by you and your career for quite some time. You took double first-class honors at Cambridge. You were awarded the Botany Prize and many others. You were the Frank Knox Fellow at Harvard. You got your MA and PhD at Cambridge, author of innumerable books and papers. And yet, everyone from the citadel of rationality wants to brand you a heretic. In fact, last night I watched a BBC presentation that was recorded in 1981, and its title was essentially that you were basically the title was Rupert Sheldrake is the most heretical scientist of our time. And then we get a quote from Sir John Maddox, who was the editor of Nature at the time, saying that your book was a book for burning. And then he went on to say that can be condemned with exactly the same language that the Pope used to condemn Galileo. It's heresy. It's pure heresy. That blew my mind, because when did science adopt the principles of the Christian church?
Well, exactly. I mean, it's a very unfortunate parallel that he chose, isn't it? Especially since Galileo turned out to be right. No, it for some reason I provoke irrational responses in some people. Luckily, not in everybody, but there's. I think the reason for this is that basically what I'm trying to do is to move the sciences on, together with lots of other people who are trying to do this, beyond the materialist dogmatism, because I think it will liberate science, open things up, and be good for science. And some people have made it into a kind of belief system, scientism, and they find what I'm doing deeply offensive. So basically, the people I'm up against are the scientific fundamentalists.
Absolutely. And the parallels, as you note, that he chose Galileo just blew my mind.
Yes.
Because he was right.
I know, it's incredible, isn't it? And the video, when you see the video, he's not joking. It wasn't a joke. He was really angry.
I agree. And One of my theories is that you bring out these sort of vitriolic and unhinged responses precisely because you come from the same exact background with the same credentials as many people who sit in the citadel of science. And so I wonder if they see you not only as a heretic, but as an apostate, one of us going outside of our dogmatic belief systems.
Well, they do see me as an apostate, and in fact, none other than Sir John Maddox, in another of his articles, I mean, that was just one of his diatribes. He wrote quite a number of diatribes against me, but another one was one in which he compared me to a lapsed Jesuit attacking the Church of Rome. So, he can't get away from these Roman Catholic metaphors. And the lapsed Jesuit thing, you see, was very much that apostate point that you just made.
There's a wonderful book, I don't know if you've read it, by Robert Anton Wilson called The New Inquisition, Irrational Rationalism and the Citadel of Science.
Yes, I have read it. Yes, I mean, it was a very good account of this thing. I mean, it's not just me and it's not just Maddox. It's a much bigger issue, really, as Wilson points out.
And it seems to me that it's continuing. Recently, you had a TED Talk basically banned. I watched it. You were incredibly reasonable. You were suggesting the dogmatic principles of science. Let's turn them into questions, and then let's apply the scientific method and see whether they hold up. And in your talk, you point out quite well that most of them don't, which you cover in your book, The Science Delusion. The one that seems to really get people worked up is this idea of morphic resonance. Essentially, didn't you also sort of learn of that from tests that were done at Harvard in the 1920s with rats trying to navigate a water maze? And their theory was you wanted to see how many generations it took intelligence to be expressed in the genetic pattern of the offspring of the rats. But what they did was they bred the smart rats together, yes, but they also bred the smart rats with the dimmer-witted rats that didn't really excel at the maze. And then they found, to their astonishment, and this was replicated in Scotland and Australia from my reading, that at the end of these experiments, rats all over the world were doing these mazes. I mean, to me, that's something you would really want to dig into and question deeply, as you did.
Yes, but you see, you're clearly not, like I'm not, someone who's a complete devotee of that materialist worldview. You see, the materialist worldview, they think the mind's nothing but the brain, that all heredity is in the genes. From their point of view, this is simply impossible. So it doesn't matter how much evidence there is. As I've found in some of my other areas of research, you can pile up the evidence. It doesn't make the slightest difference, because if they think it's impossible, then all the evidence must be flawed, and there's no point wasting time looking at it. And actually, a couple of years ago, the rationalist Steven Pinker wrote a book called Rationality, in which he actually said there's no point looking at the evidence because we know it's flawed, it's impossible. So I challenged him to a public debate on the subject. I publicly challenged him through an organization in England where both he and I had done interviews. He at first didn't reply, but then he had to reply. And he just said he hadn't got the bandwidth for the debate, meaning, I said, what does that mean? He said, basically, if I took part in a debate, I'd have to spend time looking at the actual evidence, and I just haven't time to do that. So he basically admitted, well, he'd already admitted he wasn't interested in the evidence. So, we're dealing here with a dogmatic frame of mind, which unfortunately is still being inculcated into school and university students all over the world, because this stuff goes pretty unchallenged within academic science.
What's interesting is that Pinker also goes on at length in his book, The Blank Slate, that we are in fact not blank slates at all. that we come out with, dare I say, the learnings, perhaps from the morphic resonance that you advocate for. So the disconnects just really blows my mind. Is it because of the growth of scientism, i.e., science has been morphed into a religion of sorts, where there are the holy texts, and you dare not challenge the holy texts, but the whole history of science. I think of Ptolemy, right? So Ptolemy had his ideas about the universe, and of course he noted a lot of inconsistencies, and so he just drew more and more circles until it collapsed under the weight of its own errors and led to Copernicus, right? And this is also the long history of science. When did this changeover occur, in your opinion?
Well, I think that there's always been a tendency for science to be dogmatic, and the revolution is going to have to be triggered by people outside institutional science rather than from inside, because within the conflicts would be too great. But if somebody suddenly appeared and said, there's $10 billion fund for unconventional scientific research, quite a lot of people would apply for it. But right now, the main funding agency for, say, psychical research is the BR Foundation in Portugal, which is doing a great job. But I think they give away about $1 million a year, and they fund almost everyone in the field on peanut budgets. Whereas the Large Hadron Collider, a new version of it, is just being announced for 20 billion euros. It's partly a question of funding. It's partly a question of ideas and thinking, but it's surprising to me that in countries like India, where there's no cultural preference for dogmatic materialism, on the contrary, most Indian scientists are Hindus or Muslims. They're religious. They're certainly not. I worked in India as a scientist, and I hardly ever met any hardcore materialist atheist types. But they do exactly the same kind of science as people in the West, not because they think it's the deepest approach to truth. They don't. But that's the way you earn your living. That's the way you get your grants. It's totally pragmatic in their case, not ideological. But if someone changed the rules and you could get a salary for doing something different, they'd quickly move over to something different. So it's a big revolution, because in the past, scientific revolutions involved convincing a handful of people, whereas now you've got, NIH alone spends $32 billion a year on biomedical research, and that's just one. Worldwide, it's over $100 billion a year, and that's millions of jobs and huge institutions and lots of journals, huge vested interests, and enormous numbers of textbooks and stuff. It takes a while to change something like that around.
So we must keep Planck's idea that science advances one funeral at a time to heart here, I guess.
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, a lot of young scientists are well aware of the limitations, but it's become more and more competitive for young scientists now, because only about a quarter of PhD graduates end up with permanent jobs in institutional science, and most of them then have to spend years as postdocs, low-paid postdocs in someone else's lab, basically doing the donkey work for some high-flying scientist, and low pay with no security. And then when that comes to an end, they've got incredibly specialized skills for which there's virtually no market, and only 1 in 4 will get a permanent academic post. So they're extremely competitive with each other, and that makes them very conservative, rather than bold and daring, because they're desperately keen to get a job and not to ruin their career. So that is a problem. It's all a problem. I mean, it's partly a problem of these institutional structures. So I wouldn't say that when I look among young scientists I know, in their private life, many of them are open-minded and curious, but in their actual career moves, They're very conventional because that's the way to get ahead. We've got a system that rewards incremental improvements along existing lines and is a strong disincentive to anything radically innovative. In a sense, it's different from the entrepreneurial world of business where, there's an incentive to do something new, maybe not too new, but there's an incentive to innovate and do something new. Whereas in science, there isn't really in its present form.
I like your idea very much. Our venture division of my company, O'Shaughnessy Ventures, has an investment in a company called Prophetic, and they are developing apparatus that will assist in lucid dreaming. I think you're absolutely correct about that field being far more open, far more experimental. We also are contemplating investments in many funds that are dedicated to frontier science. So that aspect of it, I think, is encouraging. And I agree that the follow the money works another way as well. Because if Prophetic, for example, has a big hit and it actually works, people are literally going to have to take notice. And yet I have a good friend who I've had on the podcast who actually is a PhD and actually was a consciousness researcher. And he left the field. He left the field because essentially he said it was so locked down and unwilling to go down any path that now this is him speaking, that was even slightly not part of canon. And yet we don't know anything about consciousness, really.
No. That's what's so ironic. It's the least understood thing of all. And from a materialist point of view, there's no explanation possible because basically they say it doesn't exist, or at least it doesn't do anything. So, no, I'm glad to know that you've got this project because I've been thinking along somewhat similar lines with some of my own research. I'm not an entrepreneur, but one of the things I've been doing in recent years is, as you probably know, I've been studying telepathy in the sense of being stared at, which are taboo topics within regular institutional science. But they're not difficult to do research on, and the experiments are quite cheap. I mean, I have a minuscule budget, so I work very inexpensively. And you can do, I was brought up on the British string and sealing wax tradition, of sort of minimal cost experiments. So telepathy tests, I've been doing these online telepathy tests on mobile phones. I've just got an app about to be released for the sense of being stared at, where you can train yourself to get better at it. The key thing here is to let people train themselves to get better. And I think that if there were a company that had an intuition training app, where there's lots of people who'd like to improve their intuition, they're not going to get taught that. You won't get Intuition 101 at Harvard or anything like that. But there are lots of people who see the point of training intuition, including in business. I mean, I'm convinced that a lot of successful business people are successful because they're intuitive, not because they're just doing nothing but calculating things from spreadsheets. I mean, there's making decisions. You always have to make a decision on the basis of incomplete information, and intuition plays a major role.
Wait, there seems to be, both in culture and in what many laymen perceive as the far more disciplined scientific method, there seems to be remnants of, like, going all the way back to Aristotle, right? Where deterministic, yes, no, 0, 100. And, the scientific method is powerfully effective. Don't even want to debate that. But there's two elements of it that have already been falsified. First, it relies on our sense data. And as you well know, our sense data is not great.
Mm.
And it also relies on pure reason. And, even Charles Dodgson, aka Lewis Carroll, in his paper, What the Tortoise Said to Achilles, made a very compelling argument for the idea that as you go down the logic tree and you get to the bottom of it, what you find is a human being asserting without proof that something was true. And so it does seem to me that okay, it works and it's great, but why this still hostility to much more probabilistic methodology? So I often say that we are deterministic thinkers living in a probabilistic universe, and hilarity or tragedy often ensue. And I just wonder, is why are they having this big or very hard time updating their thinking? I mean, again, based just on real evidence in terms of sense data, in terms of pure reason.
Well, I think, in fact, most real scientific discoveries come from intuitive, imaginative leaps. You know, as Karl Popper, the philosopher of science, said, you know, it's hypotheses and testing of hypotheses, but the hypothesis is basically a guess about the way things might be. And there's many examples of scientific hypotheses that come in a flash to people. It's not logically arrived at, it's an intuition. So that is actually part of the scientific process, and philosophers of science would agree about that. I don't think that's controversial. When it comes to the probabilistic nature of things, I think there are some branches of science where that's absolutely standard. I mean, everything to do with medical research or agricultural research is statistical, and parapsychological research and most psychology research is statistical. You know, if you're doing a drug trial, it's, you know, for a mainstream drug from a mainstream drug company, it's all based on statistics. And if you're testing out new varieties of crops, it's all statistical. So in practice, large areas of science are statistical. Everything to do with sociology, predicting the outcomes of elections, opinion polls, all this stuff is not hardcore determinism. And I think that one of the things that's loosening up, well, one of the big movements that loosened up thinking in science since the 1980s was the chaos revolution. You know, everyone knew there was quantum probability, but then the chaos revolution made us realize that actually most things are probabilistic, including the weather. I mean, the weather forecasters get it wrong, not because they're stupid or because they haven't got big enough computers, but because it really is unpredictable more than, you know, a week or two in advance, and even that's not terribly predictable. So I think in the large areas of science, this is now pretty well taken for granted. And statistical methodology is absolutely necessary. And the other thing which I think is changing it is the growth of quantum computing, because quantum computing now has billions of dollars being invested in it by all these major companies and lots of startups as well. And quantum processes are inherently probabilistic. And normally, in ordinary machines, like a computer, you want to iron out all that probabilism. I mean, I press A on my computer keyboard. I want an A to appear on the screen. I don't want T or J or something, some random letter to appear. So we've actually designed our computers and all our machines to be as predictable as possible and to iron out all these quantum fluctuations, which in large numbers they sort of average out. So we've designed our machines to avoid these problems. But quantum computing is a technology where the superposition of possibilities, the fact that many different things could happen, is an essence of the entire process, and that's why it works. And it's not terribly impressive what they can do with quantum computers yet, but if it does become impressive, then it's precisely this indeterminacy and possibility realm which is going to be the basis of it. So I think that's an area where there's a changing thinking. That's likely to have knock-on effects. So I think that the simplistic deterministic ideas. I think the problem is that people at the leading edge of science know what the problems are, And they know that there's a lot that's not known. They wouldn't be doing research if they thought all the answers were known, because you just look it up in a book. So anyone who's doing research knows that there's a lot that isn't known. The problem comes from people who've done some kind of physics 101 when they were 19 or something, and identified as a scientifically minded, modern, rational person. And the rest of their life go on with sort of undergraduate attitudes of a kind of Dawkinsite type. I think the problems I have are actually quite often with non-scientists who think they know that science is all about determinism, that everything that they don't believe in has been refuted, etc. Very ill-informed people on the whole, but they put their faith in science. So they're the same kind of people who say they're against religion because they think religion's based on blind faith and dogma. And ironically, I think that kind of scientism is based on much more blind faith than religion. I mean, anyone who's religious knows that there are lots of different religions. I mean, even if you're a Christian, you know there's Roman Catholics, Episcopalians, Methodists, Quakers, Pentecostalists, etc. And you know, lots of Muslim sects and so on. In religion, there's a wide choice. There isn't a single thing. In science, there isn't a wide choice. There is no pluralism in that same way. And so it's actually more dogmatic. In terms of blind faith, you know, if you went along and questioned somebody about the existence of the Higgs boson or said you didn't believe in electric charge or something, they're not going to say, oh, we welcome questioning minds, wonderful, you're doing critical thinking. They're going to say, no, that's wrong. You know, just look it up. Do an elementary physics course, you'll soon learn, you're just ignorant. So anyone who tries to question it is instantly put down. And this is not just some kind of abstract argument. It's very practical. When we look at anything, like I'm looking at you now, Jim, on the screen, my image of you is on the screen where you are. It's not inside my head. So I think our minds are extended in every act of perception. You know, we look at a distant star, our mind is reaching out to touch that star. We're literally over astronomical distances. If I think of somebody who I know well, who I want to call because I've got something I really want to say to them, my mind reaches out, my intention to call them reaches out to them. They may start thinking about me, and when I call, they may say, it's funny, I was just thinking about you. And I think that's the basis of telephone telepathy, that they pick up these intentions, because the mind is extended. And I think extended minds link together members of social groups, not just in human societies, but they work with pets as well. As you know, I wrote a book called Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home, about telepathic encounters with dogs, cats, and all sorts of other animals. Also about animal premonitions, like forecasting earthquakes, which has been totally neglected. That would be a viable app. We could perhaps talk about that on another occasion. Earthquake predicting app wouldn't cost much and could save hundreds of thousands of lives. So the extended mind's extended in space and time, is idea number one. And the other big idea that I've been working on for so many years now, more than 50 years actually, is of course morphic resonance. The idea there's a memory in nature, the laws of nature are more like habits. Our own memories are not stored inside our brains, we tune into them. And we also tune into lots of other people's memories, the collective memory, like Jung called it, the collective unconscious. Individual memory and collective memory differ in degree, but not in kind. We more specifically tune into ourselves because we're more similar to ourselves in the past. So the idea of morphic resonance, habits of nature, memory in nature, collective memory in each species, and our own memories not being inside our brains. So that and the extended mind are the two ideas that I'd want to put across when I had this magic microphone.